All right. So I'm gonna count to three, and we're gonna clap. So I'm gonna say one, two, three, clap. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
We
Yep.
all got to do it though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are
All
we
right.
clapping on three?
No.
No, one, two, three,
Clapping on
clap.
four.
Okay.
Clapping on four. All right. One, two, three.
Okay.
Did everybody do that together?
I did.
Sounded like it sounded like there was a late
It
one.
sounded like there was a delay.
It
but-
sounded pretty bad. Let's do that again.
Okay.
All right. One, two, three.
That was
Okay.
even worse.
that
What's
sounded
going
worse,
on with
but
the lag?
There's just lag. We're in
Really?
different places. There's got to be.
Yeah, I think it's
Because that
not
was
bad
like a
enough.
full half second after me.
Yeah. I think it's not bad enough to interfere like with conversation for the most part, but when it comes, that's why it's hard for people to like live jam with instruments,
Yeah.
like on Skype type things.
Well, Matt, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry. We really tried our best.
Try, yeah.
Should we try one more?
Yeah, we can do one more. Because
What
I
if we
love
do
that.
like one Mississippi, two Mississippi, just to like see if that's
I don't
part
think
of the problem?
I don't think the lag.
Yeah, I think it's more like it just needs to stay in the same cadence, right? If it's 1, 2, 3, clap. Right?
Yeah, do
So
it.
that everybody-
You do it, Dave. You're good at that.
Yeah.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Hey, that sounded better.
That was good.
Yeah.
That was
Okay.
good.
We're using the third one.
Yeah, we're using
Yeah,
Dave
man.
now to count off.
That's funny.
Well, good to be here with y'all.
Yeah, so what I was saying is that I think the one problem we did with the previous intros is nobody, like, as a listener, I don't, only on the decrim, but we don't know who's who and voice wise.
Yeah.
So
instead of like a formal, like, I received these awards from these institutions, like just say, you know, hey, I'm Nishay.
Sounds good.
Brian.
Hey, I'm Brian Pace.
Yeah.
no, we just go. One of us should go around and say,
the
"Hey
thing is-
guys."
the thing
We
is
just
for
start
people
like this. Hey
listening-
guys, what's going on? Brian,
but-
how's it going?
Okay.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
works.
because there has to be some connection between the name and the voice because people like just won't be able to differentiate.
Yeah, also we have 2 Brians, so that's going to be
Yeah, how about like say like Pace Normand?
yeah,
I like
Okay.
B Pace better.
B pace.
Yeah.
If people are watching this on Patreon right now, they're like,
Oh, really?
idiots! Look at these idiots.
We're professionals.
Yeah,
This is the kind of content you have to pay to get.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
All right.
See, we have
Well-
as much disdain for it in our actions as in our words.
Oh my goodness.
All right. So someone do this.
Hey, what's up, y'all? I'm Dave. Nishay, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you guys.
Hey there, I'm Brian.
Oh my
Pace.
God, this is
Yeah, I thought
awkward.
Dave was
I
supposed
thought
to
you were
go
gonna do
around.
the whole
I
thing,
thought we
Dave.
I thought we just
No,
passed
he
it
says
along.
one person
Sorry.
goes around. Yeah,
Yeah, you gotta go.
Passing
You
it
gotta go
on.
around the horn.
Like
Great,
you
gotcha.
tag.
Hey, Nishay, great to see you again.
Hey, Dave.
How's it going, Brian Pace?
Hey Dave, good to see you.
And Brian Norman, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Glad that
So-
we got everyone here and straightened
Yeah.
out those voice recognition bits.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, now that we've got that important business out of the way, I think we've got some big stuff to discuss today. It's I'm really excited that we're getting to this episode. We've been talking about this for a while. We're going to
This-
talk about climate today.
This topic was like one of the first things that we said we needed to talk about when we started even just like visioning having this podcast in the first place. So it's definitely been, you know, a lot of us have been really excited to move into it.
Sure, and this is also Brian Pace. Like your career has kind of been based around this. So
Yeah, I've only been staring down the barrel of climate change for the last 10 or so years of my life. Specifically, I was looking at how the food system is going to be impacted. So I think that, well, after a long time of looking at it, I can say it will be very much impacted. In terms of current affairs, so just recently that there are reports that there may be a French fry shortage in this
I heard that.
I heard that
because
too.
there's
Yeah.
a shortfall in the potato crop, and that may be a harbinger of things to come.
Maybe that's what will do it. That'll get the public awareness up.
Once people can't have their French fries.
They can't have their McDonald's French fries.
Yeah, but I mean, climate change, I would call the challenge of our generation, and it's odd because we're creating media here with this podcast, but in the mainstream media there's all kinds of analyses of how few minutes per year are devoted to the topic of climate change. We have weather reporters every day in every city, and rarely are these hurricanes or these forest fires directly linked to their predicted increase with climate change. So I guess we have to talk about it while we're talking about psychedelics.
Sure. I mean, and I would say it also makes sense, within the propaganda model of news media, that we wouldn't see any sort of deeper questioning or engagement with structural concerns, right? That you couldn't actually start to pick away at this because of the corporate interests involved in putting out that product. And hopefully, as a more independent outlet, we'll have scope to actually dig into that. And I mean, it does seem to relate to a lot of psychedelic discourse, or at least high and mighty ideals that folks tend to put out there as far as psychedelics and ecological awareness.
Right. I mean, I feel like climate is kind of where the rubber hits the road for like how far are you going to take that, environmental connection that you felt during your ayahuasca experience and actually do something about it.
Oh, I
Yeah.
agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and I think over the last year, several months at least, there's been more crossover between more mainstream, I guess, climate activism and drug war activism, psychedelic activism
Yeah.
in
So
general.
I just got done teaching a section of biology, and in biology, there's an evolutionary biologist. He says, Dobzhansky says, only in the light of evolution can you understand biological systems. And the way I feel about climate change is that you can't understand what's happening in the world today without understanding climate change, without having some basic understanding of what's at stake. It's a defining parameter that affects everything from our economy to the air we breathe. So we just got through the forest fire season out west. It's definitely affecting air quality in the bay.
In Australia, I was just reading something has, their summer just started and it's already really bad. So they're not even into the worst of it probably.
Right. So a lot of climate narratives get rolled into discussions about sustainability. This practice, our transportation system, our food system, our fishing system, these are unsustainable practices. And I think a lot of times that word gets our eyes glaze over and we don't really reckon with what that means. We think, this is unsustainable, so it's not like quote unquote environmental or something. But I always like to emphasize that when we're talking about sustainability, we're not talking about choices really, other than how to change from that which is not sustainable. That which is not sustainable, it doesn't matter how much we want to continue doing it. We don't have the option to continue consumption at the level that we have for the last several generations. So it's time. Change is not optional.
Sure, right. Go ahead, Nishay.
That's one of the things I do think that the last few years has made more of a mainstream idea and something that people do talk about openly in like everyday conversations. So things like taking democratic socialism more seriously. You know, I feel like that's bound up with it. And even climate stuff, because I remember like 10 years ago, I knew people who were deeply concerned about climate change, and they, to the point of like tears. And part of what they were so upset about was, why is nobody else concerned about this when all of the evidence suggests this is really bad? Whereas now it's not such an isolated thing for people. Like more of the kind of mass consciousness is concerned about this topic. So there is that shift in the past few years.
Yeah, I would say
Totally.
so. It's definitely been, I mean, for instance, it was a major part of this year's presidential debates, and I imagine it will continue to do so.
Sure. But even in the context of like presidential debates, right? Like politicians are going to be fundamentally unable to address these issues because the machinery that makes their operation possible in the first place requires those unsustainable practices.
The whole
Like
system is based on it.
precisely, and it's terminal, right? Like and so there's, as much as there's a shift in talking about it because it's in some ways no longer avoidable, that potential and presence of like recuperative factors, right, where you have this notion of a moderate approach, or even this notion that like, oh, if we only allow things to rise by 2 degrees Celsius, you know, we can tolerate that, we can handle that. And it raises for me these huge existential questions about, for what, to what ends, like at the point where humanity is engaged with like making endless consumer trinkets and you know, financial products, digital financial products. Like, why should we be sort of consigning ourselves to all of the horrors that come with 2 degrees, never mind the arrogance in asserting that, oh, we can actually, we know enough to control this.
Yeah,
So there are these fundamental tensions at play.
there's an idea that, you know, science and technology will get to a place where it will be able to deal with it. Like there's that kind of
The
justification.
techno fix.
Yeah,
Yeah,
even if we don't
as
know
Naomi
how.
Klein calls magical thinking,
Yeah, and I do want to say
scrubbing
also,
carbon.
I do want to say, really emphasize, because I mentioned like 10 years ago versus now, but I want to emphasize for people who don't know how much the environmental justice movement has been historically led by, you know, racial minorities, ethnic minorities. And so, and the racial justice movement and the environmental justice movement have really grown hand in hand, and is part of why I think it wasn't taken seriously, because a lot of, you know, communities of color in this country organized to, you know, they were the dumping grounds for, you know, the trash dumps and all the toxins, and because they could get away with it, people who made that
Lulus,
decision.
locally unwanted land uses, you just
Yeah,
stick them by poor communities and communities of color, and they're not situated in ways to actually fight back or, you know, adequately defend against that sort of legislative
well, and
push.
Yeah.
a lot of people did fight back as well, and just were not taken seriously
Right, that's
by
what I
those in
mean. They're
power.
not
Yeah,
well positioned, like as far as the structural inequalities and the way things are set up systemically, like
right.
the sort of leverage that it takes to, when, I mean, there have been like some nice a number of cases where people have pushed back after getting significant media attention and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. It just feels like each case takes so much,
Mm-hmm.
and it's baked into the systems that are currently acting, right? Like
Sure.
they
And I
goes
mean,
hand in hand.
this discourse is often talked about as environmental racism as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think we can point to several, you know, bigger events that have recently made connections for people. Standing Rock, for instance, definitely struck a nerve with people. But I think it's important that what, you know, the point Nishay is making right now is how interconnected progressive movements are, and that it really is a useful way to have climate, which is something that affects us all, be a point of unity and a rallying point for different movements to start supporting each other more. And
I love that point, because it's like no, like you're not going to get everyone to rally around psychedelics, you know, as a central
no.
point. But you're exactly right that a lot of these intersectional movements for justice can come together around something as universal as climate.
Right. And I mean, they should, especially when it's very clear that there are ways in which they can help each other tell their stories and meet their goals by building coalitions. And yeah, so I
Well,
think that, oh, go on.
yeah, I was going to say along those lines. I mean, I think that issues of climate and racial justice or equity really point to these existential questions around industrial civilization, right? Like, how much of the technology that we use on a day-to-day basis could we have if we weren't utilizing, or if companies and governments weren't utilizing coercive force to establish mining operations and using economic pressure in order to push people into situations where that may be the only way to secure food, clothes, shelter, or at least work towards it. And if we look at how much, dumping grounds were mentioned earlier, like at the point where it's cheap enough and there's a socioeconomic system in place where you can dump a bunch of scrap and folks will sort through it cheaper than any labor you could arrange in a factory, right? Because there's some sort of money to be made from melting down the components and bearing all of the health costs of melting down metals, in open air, or
E-waste. Yeah.
right,
There's a
precisely.
there's a
And
documentary called Wasteland that
yep.
that documents trash and recycled materials gatherers in Brazil, that I think is it's such a great documentary, not only because of the humanizing of the people who live at the end of the pipe, as I like to put it, of international capitalism, but also that art and beauty is something that is woven into everyone's life. Wasteland's a really great documentary.
Totally. But I think, like, when we look at sort of the questions around psychedelic activism, or the intertwining of that with these issues of race and class, if we don't actually examine sort of the underpinnings, not even, I mean, I would suggest that industrial civilization is inherently unsustainable. So the massive questions about the states that currently exist, about militaries, about corporations. And I think for a lot of people, it feels very much like, okay, well, where do we go from here? Because that notion seems far too radical, I think, to many people.
Well, yeah, and also because many of the solutions that have been put forth since Captain Planet was on TV are like their BP, shopping bag recycling program. There's a whole bunch of examples. For instance, the crying Indian, uh, take a 5-minute shower instead of a half an hour shower. All of these strategies have been shifted onto the individual to the focus away from what will do get collective action, things at their source. We need to stop digging up fossil fuels and burning them. We need to shift our energy economy, and that's an industrial scale invention.
Yeah, for sure. And even then, even if you shifted everything in the economy right now in that direction, how's it being used? Even if we got, again, the questions of what is being produced, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, this notion of mass consumption and conspicuous consumption, I think, just because that gets done in a green, quote, green fashion, doesn't present a net good to me, as there are all of the costs associated with that product. Like, none of this is sustainable,
No,
fundamentally.
And I'll say that, one of the problems of having this conversation is that just engaging with the material facts that relate to climate change, just the landscape, are so overwhelming. So, right now, I think the Paris Accords and the Paris goals, where countries commit to cutting carbon so that we can over pre-industrial achieve this 1.5 degree scenario. A lot worst, the worst predictions out there, inundation of like flooding of coastal cities, countries, low-lying countries like Bangladesh, where millions and millions of people are currently living. Even in this best case scenario, a lot and destruction will be directly related to climate change. And it's dire. When it comes down to it, to 2 degrees, we have to keep 4/5 of the fossil fuels that are currently underground in the ground. So it's a lot.
It's
And I
also
understand why people don't want to engage.
sure. And then at the same time, like as much as, as the international community talks about 1.5 and 2 degrees and things like that in the future and this, that, and the other, the Marshall Islands are underwater,
Yep.
and it's like the way, I mean,
Venice is
or
underwater.
looking, right. And looking at Trump, pulling out of that, sure. But it's worth pointing out that that was essentially toothless prior to that, because the international community recognized that the U.S. wasn't actually going to sign on to anything that made meaningful or concrete requirements, that was going to be a non-starter. So better to make it sort of a non-binding agreement, so as to avoid that kerfuffle with the U.S. And that's again, it presents that stumbling block of entrenched interests and who gets to have access to power, who has paid their way into those controls. And I think it's one reason people have been really excited seeing some of the Extinction Rebellion stuff kicking off. And there's been some really wonderful actions for sure.
Extinction Rebellion being a direct action movement, engaging in civil disobedience to address direct participants in climate destruction.
Totally. And I think, even there, and I guess it's particularly relevant as we talk a good bit of psychedelics, I was rather surprised to see the call for what it was called, like psychedelic civil disobedience or something.
Yeah.
Where the notion was to take drugs and, tell the state that people won't stand for the ongoing unfolding crisis, which to me seemed to reflect some of the interesting, and I would say maybe slightly more off the wall sentiments that seem to come up in psychedelic spaces around approaches to ecocide or resisting ecocide. That was one that it left me feeling a little confused as to its actual intention.
And the people, when I was looking at news coverage of Extinction Rebellion and psychedelics, people tended to run with that aspect of what Gail Bradbrook was suggesting. And that got a lot more media attention than her very substantive connections between psychedelics and her own activism, and really calling her other calls to mobilize the psychedelic community for, participating in these kinds of direct action.
Yeah, I mean,
Cool.
I think it's anybody worth or anybody interested in this. I would definitely recommend having them take a look at her talk, Gail's talk at Breaking Convention, where she talks about her personal, like sort of the personal side, because she is somebody who's a very serious activist on addressing climate change,
and also I think like a microbiology PhD or something like that. She has that background as well.
Right. So I mean, a lot of times what you're seeing is the scientists like myself who've been looking at this for a long time. You can't just look at this and not engage in politics, engage in the public square to advocate, because it's too much. And it's very clear that politicians and industry leaders are not only not going to do anything, but they are actively obfuscating what needs to be done and presenting roadblocks. But Gail Bradbrook's personal journey is something she talks about a little bit in that Breaking Convention talk, and it's something that I think a lot of people like myself were able to relate to. I wouldn't be an evolutionary biologist had I not had certain experiences with psychedelics at a young age, and they've been a part of my both integration of the gravity of the task at hand that we have, and they've also allowed me to sort of integrate why it's worth it to devote one's life, to these kinds of fights.
'Cause that's one of the
For sure.
the quote unquote medical uses of psychedelics that I would like to see more work around, is specifically preventing or addressing activist burnout and helping people to maintain that kind of connection to their work, despite all of the antagonistic sort of day-to-day grind that people inevitably have to face when you're challenging like the system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I uh, I've drawn parallels between what's going on in psychedelic research and the climate crisis, partly because I've been studying both at the same time. But I mean, I'm struck by these studies about hospice and psilocybin addressing existential angst. Well, we're sort of facing civilizational level existential angst when it
Right.
comes to
Yeah.
discussions of climate change.
Yeah, it's like we all have cancer, in that way. It's not just the people who have like physical cancer.
Right,
Well,
right.
and you not understanding that you and your environment are the same thing in the first place, I think could be seen as a pathology. You
Yes,
know,
absolutely.
Totally.
And that's part of what I feel like, because the connection between psychedelics and ecological activism has kind of been poo-pooed in the past, and along the lines of the skepticism about what the mass disobedience would actually entail or get at. But part of that is this idea, which can be a risk, that people just have this sense of oneness and just feel like, either who am I as an individual to think that I can control like the big picture, like I'm just one and can just be and not have to worry about anything, or just taking that kind of sense of oneness as an end in itself somehow, and not actually doing the work on the ground to change the way that things are at the moment. But one of the things that I really like to think about how psychedelics play into this whole situation is, and I think we touched on this in Brooklyn a little bit, the idea that just as like psychedelics can help you feel stuff in your body that you were repressing and pains that you weren't kind of acknowledging, and work through it, psychedelics can also help you, because the hegemonic perspective of the dominant culture, what, like you were talking about, the things that you assume to be true without knowing that you've assumed it, because it seems natural to you based on the air you swim in, in our culture.
Right.
It helps you notice like, oh wait, where'd that idea come from? Like that's not an idea that really makes sense when I look close at it. And so I think it can help people to disconnect themselves from the kind of the harmful, weird ideas like separation from nature and the possibility of perpetual consumption and productivity, in order to see the situation more clearly and
Sure.
work within that situation.
and I think
Yeah,
I think a direct linkage there is how I'd be interested in seeing how many people after they take psychedelics or start smoking marijuana, like actually one of the first things that they identify is, say, factory farming, and then they go vegetarian or something like that. That linkage seems to be quite common.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I think
Totally.
that is just real quick to add on to that the example of factory farming in particular, because it's like, it's one of those things that intellectually people know, oh, like this cheap chicken that I bought from the store, like this animal was tortured, to get to me. But it's something that a lot of people like don't allow themselves to kind of dissociate from and not think about. And so it's one of those things that when you have to face the realities of the conditions that you're participating in, then it becomes an impetus for a lot of people just to kind of choose to participate otherwise. or
Sure,
drop
but
out, as Larry would say.
I would push back just a little bit in the sense that, like, I think about these experiences as somewhat fundamentally depatterning, and but not necessarily directional. And so, I mean, I think a lot of times we end up, feeling more of our bodies and extending more and thinking about, processes that are in our lives and such. But as we've also talked about a fair bit, not only are there fascists who use psychedelics, but there's also a growing movement of eco-fascism. So I mean, it's one of those things where we have to be careful about the movement, making sure that we're thinking about how we're going to get to a place where the climate is under control. We have an equitable world for everyone. And I think we talked about this earlier, but I just wanted to say that psychedelics are a tool. They can help in some of these questions, but in others, we have to look elsewhere for what we're going to be doing. I mean, obviously.
Well, yeah, but you say obviously, but to me, that's one of the huge problems that I don't know what you want to call it, the psychedelic community, with plenty of air quotes around it,
Sure.
is facing, is this notion of psychedelics for psychedelic's sake, which you see in a lot of in a number of the psychedelic communities or meetups or things like that are going on, where there's not really, in many cases, discussion around what's the point, or like where does it go. It's a lot of like cheerleading psychedelics, in my perspective. And for me, as much as I dislike the way the Alan Watts quote is frequently used, I think this is definitely a case of like, the scientist doesn't sit at his microscope all day. When you get the message, hang up the phone. Like for me, like I can absolutely relate to, I mean, my first psychedelic experience was incredibly profound as far as messages around ecocide and my own personal involvement in systems and all of that. And yet it's like, okay, having gotten that message, it feels important to not to set psychedelics aside as in don't use them, but the notion that like we have to tote our psychedelics into activist spaces in a way that like it feels, some folks have presented that as like the through line, and I think that can sort of miss the point. Like there's so much content in my experience, and it sounds like in plenty of other people's experience, that's there, that I think gives insight into points for resistance, or presents sort of catalysts about like, this is not working, so let's attack here. Yeah, go ahead, Nishay.
Well, I was just going to say, it might be a good moment to just bring up the parallel from the counterculture of the 60s, where there was this kind of distinction between the heads and the fists, as, the people who felt like the way to change society was to go inwards and to work on the self, versus those who were on the streets and handing out pamphlets and, doing more direct kind of activism. And the example of, we haven't talked about this before, but Leary going to stay with the Panthers when he was broken out of prison, and
Yeah, in
they were
Algeria.
like, and just kind of like wanting to trip all the time, and then the Panthers were like, what the fuck are you doing, like this is like serious, and they just wanted to kind of lay around and giggle and think about cosmic truths. And so I think go ahead.
My understanding was Leary was also confronted in California when he kind of wanted just to drop out of politics. Fuck it. The other leftist groups, like, that was completely against their philosophy entirely.
Yeah, there were huge clashes.
Well, that division is actually still here today. I mean, I still talk to people who are on the left, and the issues around drug reform and all of that, and psychedelics and party culture and all that, it's viewed as sort of a potential depoliticizing, sidelining force. And I think that's one of the reasons why I thought that Gail's talk at Breaking Convention about how she was able to have an interplay between her life as an activist and her self-care. And also, I would even say, in my own life, embracing in a kind of radical hedonism every now and then in this world where, you know, work is centered and, you know, suffering is sometimes held up as a, you know, as this aspirational thing. Stealing a little bit of ecstatic wonder from the world is a revolutionary act. And not only that, I would say that a just world that I would like to see us build would be one where we all work less. And when we work less, we, okay, so there's a study that basically says that if we, in major consuming economies like the United States or European nations, if we reduced working time by half, by 3/4, which we certainly could do given the amount of productivity we've gained since the 70s, since the post-World War era. Global emissions, half to 2/3 of the global emissions that are currently locked in, or that are not currently locked in, would evaporate, because we're all just driving back and forth to a job. And David Graeber did some great work on this in a book called Bullshit Jobs, where you know, he has people essentially self-identifying their work as not being productive for society at all. I think we can think of a couple of different industries where that might be the case. You know, in some of these presidential debates, it's happened several times over the years. We'll have presidential candidates being asked by moderators, which arm of the government would you eliminate if you could choose one or had to choose one? And they, oh, you know, the Department of Education or whatever. I have never seen a moderator say, which industry would you eliminate?
Yeah.
And I think we need to start having those conversations. We need to start talking about how we should be directly confronting the fossil fuel industry, because we have very clear evidence that if they are allowed to continue their operations unimpeded, we're doomed. And I want to
still
take,
like trillions of dollars of oil sitting in the ground right now, then, you know,
right.
they
And
need
it's
to be
all
coerced
subsidized.
into not extracting that.
Right. So
They're going to do it.
the current economy that we
Right.
have is all completely subsidized. So like many oil fields would not be profitable. We already know that the Pentagon is going around the world securing resources in these resource wars. So I guess the thing is that when we talk about, you know, transitioning to a more just and sustainable economy, and how much is it going to cost? Well, the economy that we have right now costs a ridiculous amount of money in treasure and blood, and it's subsidized by the government. And the thing is that the government could subsidize other things. And I wanted to take just like 2 seconds to plug this excellent book. It's called A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal, by Arnoff, Battistoni, Cohen, and Rio Francos. It's one of these movement roadmaps, and it talks about a lot of different things, and mainly in terms of reframing our narratives and building a movement that that takes this kind of unrest that we're seeing and considers it an asset. You know, people are unhappy, and there are dozens of countries right now that are being overturned by protests, and we can use that to seize power and use it for different means.
Mm-hmm. And do you mind if I quickly return back to Gail Bradbrook's talk, just because you were talking about self-care?
Yeah.
I agree with everything you're just mentioning, but the self-care aspect was like one part of what she did when she like went into this ceremony, and she really stressed how important she felt intentionality was behind like what she was doing, that it is this agnostic, amoral tool that can be used different ways. So she came to the experience, the ceremony, intentionally hoping to deal with her own shadow kind of aspects of her personality that were holding her back from being a more effective activist and a more fully kind of embodied person. And she had been specifically working in activism, as you were mentioning before, for a really long time, and felt like she was missing something, or there was something that wasn't really gelling in all of her previous efforts. And she felt like she got this, message of how to move forward. And then, Extinction Rebellion kind of grew out of that process. So getting the idea that psychedelics can help in your toolkit to make you a more effective activist, I think is a really important framing for some of these, topics and conversations, that it's not just about the experience of oneness, which psychology experience, which recent psychology publications have emphasized is correlated potentially with pro-social and pro-environmental behavior, but that's not even the most important thing that can come out of this. It's that, helping in this larger fight.
I would also say that, taking psychedelics is currently illegal, and it's something that is an important rite of passage when so many of the things that need to be accomplished puts one directly in conflict with institutional power. Howard Zinn is famous for saying it's not civil disobedience that's the problem. Civil obedience is the cause of so much suffering in life. And it's no more apparent than in the issues that are facing us with climate change. Like, us going along with business as usual will doom us.
It has so far.
We're supposed. This is what's happening is supposed to have happened. Like, that's how this has all been programmed the whole time, and it will continue on this course.
An inevitable consequence of decisions that were made. I just wanted to stress that interpretation, because what was supposed to have happened could be interpreted in a kind of like woo way, but it's like the material conditions were leading towards this moment.
It shouldn't come as a surprise.
But and I think that hits it on the head, like the material conditions, like I think especially as we situate this conversation within psychedelic spaces, the importance of focusing on and analyzing the material conditions, it feels to me, can't be overstated. And I say it can't be overstated because so much of the discourse seems to put that aside, whether it's spiritual bypassing or it's a notion that everything is perfect, here in the now as
it's all
is.
good, man.
Right, exactly. There are so many ways where there's this magical thinking where, again, like, oh, it feels so good. I felt connected. We're going to see unity and oneness come out. And like, no, this hasn't been written yet.
We don't focus on root causes. Even within psychedelic activism, we don't focus on root causes. That's why there's such a disconnect. Something that I've been thinking about for years is just up until this last year, where you started to see more decriminalization, psilocybin decriminalization. There's been a huge disconnect, and people are aware of this, between psychedelics, the psychedelic movement for legalization, and just broader civil movements. There's a huge gap that's between there, and even within psychedelic science and activism, there is an unbelievable gap and failure to recognize root causes of the exact problems that they're trying to solve. Depression and suicide and anxiety and all of these things, they're not looking at root causes at all. It's an unbelievable failure to even do that, and to bring that up, it creates sort of, why are you talking politics? Why are you talking all of these?
Your landlord talks politics all the time.
All of these things, and
that.
Back to hang on one second, and back to the point that I was saying, and the show that you commented on is these levels of depression, anxiety, and suicide. They're also like, this is what we get for failing to look at root causes. Having depression is a result of the environment that we've created. You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying.
I'm making?
I mean, I think I know what you're saying. I mean, so I'm a cyclist. I'm a daily cyclist, and I've barely owned a car. I owned a car for about 6 months. In any case, the built environment determines so much. So I live in Columbus, Ohio. When I moved here a decade ago, it was the most obese city in the nation. It's also a textbook example of urban sprawl. Okay. So, like, riding a bike here is not easy. I would say it beats the alternative. But the idea is that um, what we invest in terms of the built environment and our social structures, it determines a lot about what's happening on the individual level, which
It
is why
determines the
individuality is so
public health
fucking bullshit.
outcomes.
Because collective action, either by the government and industry or by communities and coalitions, is what is going to move resources and affect the physical material conditions that we interact with all day, every day. And one of the things that that Arnoff et al. Of A Planet to Win talk a lot about is how, we need massive public investment in the public sector for something they call public affluence. We need to build public spaces, not only because it's going to change things in terms of investments in mass transit. For instance, I grew up in Portland, Oregon. The mass transit out there materially improves the conditions of people's lives. It takes cars off the roads. People get out more. They walk more. But it's also something that reduces the burden of loneliness and just all kinds of things that come with car culture. And it's not just car culture, but it's also the atomizing of the, what do they call it, the lone bowler syndrome. People aren't meeting or working too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Nisha, you're going to say something.
Well, I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that the auto companies were actually like instrumental in getting this like sprawlish layout for society, because of people would need more cars, and
Why wouldn't they be
more advantageous to have it that way? And then there are bizarre like rules for number of parking spots. Like there's this very down run shopping center near where I live that you have to drive to, and all the stores are in the middle of this like vast complex of just asphalt, and there's no way to walk. The walking there is like dangerous because you have to go across all these roads to get there. So it's definitely
and it's all on the
rethinking.
best farmland.
Right.
Yeah.
But all of this comes back to who has power in society. I mean, many people so we have constant development going on around the campus here in Columbus, and so many land use issues could be solved if we had an effective way of telling developers not to build in stupid places. I mean, currently we're looking at climate change, since that's the topic of the day. There's a whole bunch of beachside property all over the world that is just going to be flooded. And so this is where we see both the economic effects of climate change dovetailing on the environmental effects as well, where the refusal to engage with what scientists have been saying for a long time, it affects the built reality that we live in. We're not planning for the future. We don't have a multi-generational society.
And forget refusal to engage. Like, what about entrenched ignorance, where, like, I mean, I've been in North Carolina for too many years, but there was a point in time where the legislators were looking to make it so that scientists had to use outdated climate projections and models so that they couldn't present exponential growth or exponential changes to like sea level, in order to, if I recall correctly, make it so that insurance companies would still underwrite all of the beachfront development. Right. And so it's like the economy is literally driving, or this notion of what the economy should be, or what industry needs to be supported, or how it should be cared for, right, is basically presenting a false narrative about reality, because that makes the people who write the funding checks, happy,
Yeah.
right? So
And it's short-term profits, you know, along with that. So like the example I was reading recently about how the architecture of houses, that before international kind of companies started getting involved in development, there was local ways to build using local materials that would be appropriate to the kind of temperature that people were dealing with. But now it's cheaper to kind of mass produce these sort of like cookie cutter houses that don't take into consideration where they're being built. And then you have to pump them with air conditioning or heating in ways that you wouldn't have to if you were actually doing
Oh,
things
this is
appropriate to the
globalization, isn't
environment.
it?
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
not just globalization. I would call that colonialism, because
Yeah, no, because
colonialism
it's
through
happening in a lot of
over and over.
third world countries. Mhm.
Yeah, over and over, colonialism replicates models that are completely inappropriate to the lands that they've invaded and taken and seized control over. So I mean, like this dovetailing, I guess the this dovetailing of the multiple intersections between different issues, it comes up over and over again. And I mean, in term, I'm stumbling over my words. Uh, go on. I made my point.
Well, I mean, those HVACs aren't going to sell themselves. You know, you gotta pump all of the components out. Otherwise, how do you reflect a profit? I mean, again, we're chasing. It's like we're chasing this myth in pursuit of profits and unable to recognize, even though it's staring us in the face, that like over the long term, which economics never seems to deal particularly well with, like, you know, if we don't exist, it doesn't matter how much wealth has been accrued wherever. You know, at the end of the day, like it's a shit measure for actually determining any sort of progress or notion about where we are and where we want to go, in my
But the
opinion.
economy is doing great right now.
But
The
I think
economy is doing great. It's like I think 50. I just read an article. I think 52 or 54% of people are like, you know, really support Trump on the economy right now. You know,
Yeah.
and it was talking about if he hones his message, if he stays on message, he has an incredible chance of being reelected just based on the economy. You know,
But
so
I
even
think,
people understand like it's a disaster right now. But hey, my investments, you know, my
and that's
investments
the
are going to
thing
be
though,
good.
that like who has investments? It's older folks have investments.
Sure.
And when it comes to the climate movement, it's not just, you know, indigenous folks and people of color who have been leading the charge for decades, but it's also youth. And right now we're seeing the Sunrise Movement being a youth-led direct action climate change focused movement. And we're also seeing one of the most powerful voices on climate change right now, who is currently in Madrid, having rerouted her trip, Greta Thunberg. She rerouted her trip from Chile, where there was going to be the COP 25. It's a climate meeting that happens every year where they never get anything done. This, you know, she was going to go speak, and you know, she's incredibly inspiring in a very short period of time. The focus that she's been able to redirect on the things that actually need to be done. There needs to be action from politicians and from movements that are following what the scientists have been saying for years. Anything less is completely unacceptable. And it's just it's one of those things where these fresh eyes, and also the stakeholders, I mean, people who are 30 to 50, yeah, these are people who care about their investments and the stability of the economy. People with their entire lives in front of them and who never had any investments want to see change and will benefit greatly, you know, from certain kinds of change.
there's also an element I feel of like emperor's new clothes to the situation, where like once she said it with like what the f are you guys doing just sitting around, like this is an emergency.
The
Suddenly a
house
lot
is
of
on
people,
fire.
the house is on fire, a lot of people are like, oh, I guess the house is on fire. And part of what I really appreciate about what she's doing is she's been working really hard to prevent herself from being the kind of like gentle inspiration that like, oh, I'm glad someone's doing that, and
Mhm.
you know, glad that's covered, and you know, the way that she's rejecting awards and even with large sums of money that come with them, and saying,
Mhm.
no, like, I don't want your celebration, I want you guys to be like pissed off and to be doing something. So
She says, I want you. And
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the reasons why we wanted to have this episode for a long time is the recognition that, you know, the drug culture is a fairly affluent one. There's a lot of parties, but there's also a lot of creativity that I think is probably untapped. You know, a lot of folks in the psychedelic community look at Burning Man as some sort of, you know, big brain mecca where you can get all of your new cultural ideas from or something. And that, you know, maybe has some cachet, but the reality is that
No.
there's so much.
There it is.
There's a pushback. There's so much more that could be done with this movement in terms of building bridges to a future that actually
It's about
has
building bridges.
viability.
It
Yeah.
has to be about building bridges. If you're into drug reform but you don't understand the systemic issues that underlie that, you miss the point.
Well, and
No,
also
In the
there's
same way, you
in
miss
the
it.
drug community in terms of there are tools for addressing the traumas that people in frontline communities and activist roles are just accumulating until, as Nishay said earlier, they burn out.
And there's also the whole psychedelic history of developing approaches to meme warfare with humor and playfulness involved. I mean, Leary went in that direction. You know, he was like, the resistance to psychedelics that he was dealing with in his, you know, career and lifetime was deeply entrenched in the society. And the only way to address that would be to introduce new frameworks, new ideas to shift the way that
he's coming
Right.
up against people who were born in 1900. You know, like
Right.
really.
Yeah.
And we're,
Right.
you know, we're coming up against people who were born in 1940 right
Mhm.
now in positions
Okay,
of political
boomer.
power.
Yeah, yeah. I side note, I got some really stupid academic like criticism. Well, it's framed in a really like on a paper I submitted, revise and resubmit, and it was like so highfalutin and like pearl clutching, and how could you not see things the way that I do? And I was so tempted to just respond, "Okay, boomer," in my my revisions.
But as far as people like missing the point, I mean, I thought that the message that we got about you know, whatever sort of lefty causes having
You want me to bring it up? I replied to him and
I know you said
I
he
told him I might read it. Should I?
live. I think you should read it.
What is this?
Okay, read it. Give us some
It's-
context.
Yeah, well,
So,
continue while I find it.
Okay, sounds good.
So basically, you know, and Norman was talking about it earlier when he was talking about the degree to which people miss the root causes, you know, underlying maybe even campaigns or issues that they're behind, that they're supporting, that they're working on. But they don't actually grasp the histories at play. They don't recognize, you know, okay, so you're opposed to the criminalization of drugs, and yet, you know, you're lashing out at supposed lefties who are trying to tie this to like histories of racism and xenophobia and white supremacy, and you know, it's like there's this fervor to, I think, engage with this perceived ideological divide, or right, this notion of you are aligned in ways that are, you're going to be sharing political ideologies that I fundamentally disagree with, to a point where like some of that history goes right out the window. And it was sort of an absurd, I thought it was an absurd response.
Well, if you first learned
or-
about psychedelics from Joe Rogan, it's certainly not surprising that somebody might come up with ideas that don't take into consideration that essentially many psychedelics are indigenous technologies that were driven underground in the first place by colonial violence.
Precisely.
Well, most people don't know history either. So, I mean, so on our second episode, Decriminalization Now, the show description, we sent out an emailer, and the show description is the historical record is clear. Drug prohibition is directly connected to the prosecution of minorities, ethnic or political. Not only do we see a complete lack of scientific or evidentiary basis for prohibition and criminalization, we can see it has been a product of white supremacy, xenophobia, misogyny, and imperialism. And so this person, he selected that and copied that, and he sent this reply. Sorry, people, but the paragraph below is one of the dumbest, most misdirected things I have ever read. I am completely against prohibition simply because it doesn't work. Leftist dummies can't blame every single thing on earth that they don't like on evil, sexist, racist whites. Give me a fucking break.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, and if you can't if you can't trace mass incarceration to just you know, if you don't see that as a consequence of the historical record, then you miss the point.
Well, similarly, if we
Miss the
can't
story.
talk about if
You
we can't
stepped
talk
in at
about
chapter 5, you didn't read from chapter 1.
if we can't talk about the ecological crisis without also discussing
Capitalism.
right, and histories of extractivism and colonialism and neocolonialism and mining and refining that are all presented, as you pointed out earlier, as business as usual. This is just the way it is because this is the way it has been. And you really like your smartphone and your computer, don't you? Like, you wouldn't want to go without that. Like, you know, we have to discuss those social, racial, economic disparities and the oppression and coercion that have historically gone with them and that are continuing to unfold.
I am hopeful. I have to say, I am hopeful about it. I'm seeing more people connect the dots on this. You know, Erica Dara, who works with us, she's doing things with the Sunrise Movement now. You're seeing a lot more interest in from drug reform activists with climate change. I think that those dots are starting to be there. So I am hopeful about that, of people connecting, like, you know, one issue to the other, to
Well,
its root cause.
It's not just going to take connecting it intellectually, because there's going to be some messiness in these groups coming together, some uncomfortableness, some, you know, hurt feelings being worked out. And an example of this is actually Extinction Rebellion, which right now is dealing with some press about how, well, they're largely white kind of people gathering and the privilege of being able to be arrested. And some people who have long worked in climate justice, who have, you know, communities of color, say that this is kind of like shifting things in a way that's making it more dangerous for communities of color to kind of, because they can't, if this is the definition of what it means to be active, people can't put themselves in the line in that way. And so there's a necessary kind of teasing out of, yes, and, you know, yes, we're doing what we can, yes, we're trying to include people, and yes, it's not ideal right now, but we're working in that direction. And being able to tolerate the uncomfortable moments where people say, like, why are all of you white? Where are the people of color? You know, and being able to work through that rather than using that as like more reason to cause divisions.
Sure. I mean, I think that, you know, we should be trying to find ways to acknowledge our sources as much as possible. I mean, I am influenced profoundly both from reading about Indigenous peoples and also working in some of those communities. And I take deep inspiration from the way that they've have fought in more materially successful ways than I ever have in my entire life against some of the most powerful corporations in the world, who are, you know, polluting their environment. And the only reason why I have been in contact with some of these groups is because of their successful campaigns to raise awareness to people like myself. So, I mean, I guess the thing is that when I think about what radical kinds of actions have been taken, it doesn't get much more radical than defending your own home and community. And the ones that are most often under attack are those in third world nations, poor countries, in, you know, minority and POC communities in the United States and elsewhere. So there's a lot to be learned, and it can only be learned through open dialogue.
Totally. And I think when you point out that, you know, or raise the question of what's more radical than sort of defending your own home, and it becomes really clear cut, right? When you have somebody from a foresting company or a mining company come in and actually take action to remove material resources. And yet, if we look at the water supplies coming into our house, if we look at the air we breathe, if we look at the food we eat, like we're all sort of under attack on a daily basis. And the way that gets pulled away from us, the way we lose sight of that, and the way, I think it sort of hides the degree to which drastic steps are needed to really meet this.
I want to point out that actually some of the criticism that Greta Thunberg has faced is similar to this, is that, you're this spokesperson who is elevated and you happen to be a young articulate woman from a Scandinavian country. And she has definitely pushed back and highlighted and the work of other youth activists and people in communities of color and indigenous communities, and even through her recent trip through the United States, had gone to reservations to highlight the works in areas like North Dakota, where many of these resource fights are happening in frontline communities. So before we wrap, I wanted to talk a little bit about post-apocalypse, because we know that we're going to see a lot of climate-related catastrophes on the scale of Katrina and worse. But the thing I like about the post-apocalyptic genre is it says that the worst has happened, and then it asks what happens next.
And I feel like that visioning, like what happens next, not just like recognizing the stress, but also like thinking about alternatives and what we can do, is really important. And so we probably save most of that for I would guess the next episode, because I feel like there's a lot to dive into there.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think we could definitely talk an entire episode on that. I mean, there's so many alternative futures that are worth unpacking. But I guess when talking about climate change, I think what's important is to push back against the idea that laying down and rotting is the thing that we should do because we're all doomed.
Yeah, but a little bit of fear is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
as well. One of the I don't even want to think about what like climate change is going to do to political systems, with migration. It's if we're already in this level now, okay, I imagine what pressure that's gonna apply to borders all over the world.
sure.
People
the
fleeing.
ability to dream about better futures is also like a powerful motivator.
Yeah,
Sure.
I mean,
I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here. I am trying to point out, as you've said about Greta before, like, yeah, like, she wants you to get pissed and be afraid of. I might be misquoting her on this, but like, that's a reality.
Yeah,
I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Yeah.
One of the things I think about change is that, they say change is the only constant. And in life, it seems that, if you plan for and embrace change, things are going to go a little bit better. But if you deny it and try and be avoidant about it, you sort of get what you get. And I guess that would be a takeaway I'd like people to consider, because we do have agency in terms of what to do about climate change, and we'll revisit the topic later in future
just
episodes.
last point along, because in the psychedelic kind of studies that are going on, they train people for how to deal with the bad trip stuff that comes up, and the point is not to not have those experiences, but to have the tools to really accept it and work through it. And so the same thing definitely applies here.
Absolutely.
Here.
Well, thanks so much for all of our listeners for chiming in. We, Brian, do you want to say something about Norman, about the, what's it called? Patreon or anything? Direct people?
No, that's coming on in a second.
Okay.
Oh, well, what if instead for this one, we just made, our cluelessness about the Patreon, the actual pitch to like give to the Patreon.
What? I don't know. I don't know what you
what
mean.
that was
I
either.
don't get it.
Never mind then.
Yeah, but if you have feedback, send it to us. You might get it read on the podcast.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
So long.
Likewise.
Okay.
Shay, don't stop recording.
Oh no. Okay. Sorry.
No.
So,
Oh, is
This is
the
for
bonus?
this is the bonus stuff for our patrons.
yeah.
I think we have done way better than I think that our conversationalism and everything is like, this is like way more along the lines of what I was like envisioning than some of our more scripted stuff.
Cool.
Sure.
I think part of that is like really resisting talking through everything ahead of time.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, part of me though, there's certain facts that I need to make sure that we have as common points of discussion, especially for for our listeners who we have no idea what their knowledge base is. I mean, I talk to y'all plenty, and I know you're aware of many of these facts. But I mean, I think one of the things we didn't even talk about here is that I think a very large percentage of the U.S. population is in complete denial about whether or not climate change is happening at all. And so in many ways, this is like,
It is polling better though in the last handful of years though.
Sure.
Whee! Yeah, I think also though, like, not to dismiss that, but to some extent, like, people have Google. People can look things up. I don't know that we have to, like, yeah, I think it's definitely good to have touchstones and anchor points.
I feel like our target audience is not trying to get people interested. Like, we're more talking to people who are like already concerned. It's like we're not
Fair.
talking to like middle America.
I would imagine the psychedelics focus definitely filters
You mean,
a little bit for
are we
that.
trying to get are we trying to get bipartisan support?
Yeah,
Reach across the aisle.
Well, so actually, Chris Hayes and David Roberts, he's a Vox journalist who covers climate for a long time. They had a podcast discussion about climate change and this issue, where there's research on psychology about essentially about belief and why some communities seem to just accept climate change and divide it on political lines. You have folks on the right who no amount of convincing seems to make a dent. And they basically said that it's about trust. It's effectively tribalism, and that on the left, or even just liberals, scientists are still within the circle of trust. But on the right, because of things like the abortion debate and evolution and all that kind of stuff, scientists are no longer viewed as trustworthy. So, fuck.
Which is weird. Yeah, well, perhaps a lot of the media that is consumed, is funded by climate change denial.
Sure.
Dollars, Coke dollars.
Perhaps some of the, I mean, there's a great book called One Nation Under God, that details how just after the crash of the stock market in like 29, that essentially big business got together and said, holy shit, what are we going to do? Nobody trusts us in society. And they said, oh, well, let's just pour a bunch of money into evangelical Christianity. And they did. And that just shifted the center of influence. And then you get prosperity gospel in the United States. People who say that we should have glitter jets, and that means that God favors us. And
yeah, well, and that the people who don't have glitter jets and have nuclear waste next to their house, that those people somehow like did something to deserve that, and that it's going against God to try to make their situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a very self-serving narrative that is foisted upon people.
It's convenient to have it.
Yeah.
I just want my glitter jet.
Well, I was just because our local high school is ranked like miserably,
Mhm.
and the elementary school is really good. And so I was really confused. I was talking to Ben about this, like, why do we have like a failing, like one of the worst in the state, kind of high schools? And I was watching something on Vox yesterday. They just put
Mhm.
out this thing about how the school rankings work,
Yeah.
and it's actually ostensibly how good the school is, but really the things they're measuring, it only really gets across how diverse, how many Black and brown people are in the school. And then they were, at the end of it, they were like, well, what are people really concerned about? Like, that is what they want to know. They do want to send their white kids to the white schools, and that, but
Jesus.
it's like by having that mediation, you don't have to acknowledge that. You don't have to face that that's actually what you care about. And so
Right.
it allows a lot of liberals even to say, oh, I'm not racist,
Right.
and to say
I just
my
want
kid
good
just works
schools.
harder. Yeah. When really it's completely ignoring the whole systemic issue.
Well, in the United States, we fund schools based on your zip code,
Which is
and
garbage anyway.
given that we know that redlining is still a thing, that is the way to maintain segregation,
Mhm.
and also make sure that rich communities don't have to fund communities of color or
Mhm.
poorer communities. And that's where educational disparities start. And it makes no sense at all. I mean, we could just fund things at the state level and allocate based on how many students you have.
Well, and
Like,
not only that, but there's so many studies that say, like, by the time you're in kindergarten, a lot has already been set for you in terms of
sure.
like how prepared you are to learn. And that if the state were to invest in pre-K, that would, a lot of the disparities between Black and white kids nationally would go away, because
Well,
that's where
not only that, you have children in the United States going to school, and they have had no breakfast.
right,
You can't learn if you have an empty stomach.
parents are in
and
jail,
and
so
we've
they're
got
having to deal with that.
we've got like school lunch debt, where people are being children are being
And
penalized for not having
shamed,
enough money, and
publicly
shamed
shamed.
for not having food. And what's so crazy is that, like we were talking earlier about, like radicalism in the United States, and like the difference between some of the folks that are in the psychedelic community and the Black Panthers. Well, the Black Panthers one of their main contributions was starting a like elementary school lunch program. And for this, among other things, like trying to defend themselves, they were ruthlessly crushed. But like I
Community
would say,
clinics.
those community clinics, like the Young Lords, were another version of, like a Puerto Rican version of the Black Panthers. They took over a hospital that had closed and reopened it. And these kinds of things, more than anything, are the things that will elicit the ire of the authorities. It's what Noam Chomsky called the threat of a good example.
Sure. Well, and it'll also elicit the ire of plenty of so-called well-meaning liberals.
Oh yeah.
That's not your property. You can't
Right.
do that. I mean, I've been there. Like, it's absurd.
Oh, well, I mean, just the discourse in protest, the aftermath of protests, where violence is being conveyed as we're moving it as something that, so if police beat the shit out of a bunch of, nonviolent demonstrators exercising their First Amendment rights, that's not violence, because it's state violence, and state violence is legitimate. But when one or two black blockers, like, spray paint a Starbucks or something, that's violence.
Well, violence is a total floating signifier. There was I think it was a Canadian newspaper that, after like 2001 free trade protests, riots, whatever, they ran a line that was something like, violence erupted at the protest when protesters threw tear gas back at police.
That's a good one.
Where did it come from in the first place? Yeah.
Good reporting.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's just crazy because the class divisions of who gets to be groomed to be in an LA Times reporter or something are so clear, because you wouldn't even think to write something like that if you yourself had never been gassed by the police,
Right.
Or I don't know if I
Or
said
if you
that
had
right,
been.
but yeah.
Yeah.
But those people are never, if you don't pass the obedience tests, you will not be invited into the rule of respectable, stuff. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons. I think I saw that pretty early in life. 'Cause I worked in PR when I was real young. And in some ways, like, I have sort of intentionally sabotaged my white male, like, privilege by leading with things like, yeah, let's talk about psychedelics, or organizing giant naked protests on bikes. Like, these kinds of things, I think, inherently like kneecap my ability to turn into some fucking
to
elite
capitalize
asshole.
on that privilege. Yeah. But I would like to, if you guys are up for it, have some, even if it's a short recording next time, about the experiences with the Pinchbeck article, because
Sure.
I just find the community reaction to be like very interesting.
In fact, I was thinking before we hopped on this that we should record something on that article.
Sounds
Do y'all
good.
want to we could do a hot take in the next couple days?
Yeah,
We could do a hot take now if you want.
I think
I
we can
haven't read
do
any of this shit, really.
we can do it. We can do it now if you guys want to.
Let's
I would advocate for a short break.
yeah, I would too. Why don't we just like pause the recording so there's not a big break?
Should I stop it and then like let it be its own thing, and then
Yeah, that's probably easier too. And
okay, how about we start like a whole new meeting room, like
sounds good.
okay,
So
All
we're gonna
right,
close
so
this
long,
out.
everyone.
Yeah.
Let's meet back here at 3:30.
sounds good.
Okay, cool.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.